Welcome to episode 272 of Real Health Radio. You can find the show notes and the links talked about as part of this episode at 7, so the word all spelled out, seven-health.com/272. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Real Health Radio. I'm your host, Chris Sandel. I'm a nutritionist and a coach, and I help clients to fully recover from disordered eating and an eating disorder so that their days are no longer governed by fear and anxiety, and instead they can live a meaningful life that is in alignment with their values. So before I get started with this episode, I want to let you know about something new that is coming soon, and it's actually been in the works for a while now. I'm going to be launching a group program that shows you how to reach a place of full recovery. And it uses the exact same framework that I apply with clients, but in a group setting. And the program is going to start in late May and will run for 12 weeks. And this is specifically for people who are ready to recover and want the guidance and the support to make this a reality. And I sent an email on Monday and Thursday for those who're on my list, and there's been a really incredible response, much more than I thought. So I'm really stoked about that. And if you like this podcast, if you like the information I share, the approach they take, and you want to take it from merely information to getting the support to make practical changes in your recovery, then this is for you. There will be limited spots available, so if you're interested, please send an email to info@7-health.com with the word group in the subject line, and I'll send over further details. So the email again is info@7-health.com and put group in the subject line. So on with today's show. And today's show is a guest interview, and my guest today is Eva Merrell. So Eva is a former US national team swimmer and the number one recruit at the University of Georgia. And after battling her eating disorder diagnosis and sport-ending injury, Eva shifted to mental health advocacy in athletics. She's currently pursuing her master's degree in sports management and policy at the University of Georgia and works as the social media manager for the mental health nonprofit, The Hidden Opponent. Eva is passionate about speaking up about eating disorders in athletics, advocating for student-athlete mental health, and using her story to help educate and inspire others struggling with eating disorders. So it was towards the end of last year that I became aware of The Hidden Opponent. So they did a collaboration with the National Alliance for Eating Disorders, and I saw a number of posts about it on Instagram, and I then started looking into The Hidden Opponent and really liked what they were doing and the support they were offering in terms of mental health with sport. And so I reached out to see if anyone from the organization was interested in coming on the show, and they suggested Eva. And I'm really glad that they did, because I think that this is a fantastic episode where we had a lot of time to go through Eva's eating disorder history and where she's someone who was on track to be heading to the Olympics for swimming, but the development of an eating disorder prevented that dream from materializing, and she was sent on a different path. So the majority of the interview is about Eva's story, and she was very honest about her experience. So if you are someone dealing with an eating disorder, there's going to be a lot that resonates here. If you are someone where exercise is a big part of your identity and your eating disorder, then this is really going to resonate as well. And then we also spend time talking about mental health in sport more generally and the work that The Hidden Opponent is doing. I got off the call with Eva and was just really struck with what a great job she did in this interview. Like, I know I didn't have the capacity to speak so clearly, eloquently, and vulnerably at age 23. I struggle to do it now. So I know you're going to enjoy this one. At the end, I have a recommendation for you, but for now, here is my conversation with Eva Merrell from The Hidden Opponent. Hey, Eva, welcome to Real Health Radio. Thanks for taking the time to chat with me today.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
So there are two broad areas that I want to chat about today. And one of them is your personal story. So you are someone who was on the US national swim team and has also battled with an eating disorder. And so I'd love to talk about and for you to share about your experience. And then the other area is about mental health in sport more generally. And I know you now work for the nonprofit, The Hidden Opponent. And so it would be great to talk about this organization and what it's doing and some of the areas that it focuses on. Does that sound good?
Yes, of course.
So let's start with you. How did you get into swimming?
I got into swimming at a young age. My parents wanted me and my siblings to be water safe, which is a very common theme with swimmers. I did summer league. Summer league was kind of the very formative beginning, and I loved it. It was super, super fun. And when I was 10, I kind of made the transition from just a summer league swimmer to looking at swimming more seriously, and then started competing competitively when I was around 10.
Okay. And were you the kind of like sporty kid who was into lots of other sports, or it was kind of predominantly swimming?
I was a sporty kid for sure. It was mostly my parents encouraging me to play sports. I did basketball, I did flag football, volleyball. I kind of tried a lot of things to see what my interest was, but I'm not a very rough and tough athlete. I didn't like the kind of, basketball where you're just getting it like up with other athletes. So swimming was super individual, and I could kind of deal with it by myself. And I really enjoyed that aspect of the sport.
Nice. And were your siblings also equally as good at swimming? Did they take to it the way that you did?
My brother was a pretty decent swimmer growing up. My sister, she liked it, but it wasn't her forte. So I was the only one that ended up swimming competitively. They kind of stopped around 10, 11 and pursued other avenues.
Okay. And how was that transition from it being just this, I don't know if it was a fun thing that then became a serious thing, but how was it to then have it become more of a bigger thing?
Yeah, that's a great question. When I was in summer league and started competitively swimming, I lived in Colorado, which was a very small swimming community.
Yeah.
And it was solely based on me just having fun and doing it because I wanted to. And when I was 11, I moved to Southern California, which is a just breeding ground for great athletes and great swimmers. So I wasn't really prepared for the shift in seriousness in the sport from Colorado to California. So it was a decent transition to begin with, but when I moved to California, it definitely got more serious, and I realized that just because I was 11 didn't mean it had to just be fun. There were some kids out there who really, really took it seriously.
Yeah. And that rubbed off on you, or it took a while for you to kind of take that on board?
It did rub off on me. I'm not going to lie, it scared me at first. I was like, why are these kids so serious about it? It's just a fun sport. But then when I was starting to get a little better around 12, I was putting up some great times and swimming fast. I kind of saw for myself like, wow, I could be really serious about it and I could be a great swimmer. So I think that was sort of the shift, is when I personally started to perform better. I realized how open the future was in terms of my involvement in the sport.
Okay. And what was the reason that you guys moved out to California?
It was for my dad's job. He had lived in California most of his life, and he took a job in Colorado. We lived there for the first 11 years of my life, but my family was there for like 15. And then work and family, I have a lot of extended family out in California, so we kind of made the jump back at that time.
And how was that jump back for you?
Also a great question. Really, really tough. The culture difference between living in a small town in Colorado. I lived in Newport Beach, California, and it's just a very different culture, very different way of life. So I personally definitely struggled a lot, just more in terms of school and dealing with like a new school system and new friend groups. But I definitely found my way. And I think the one blessing of sport is you automatically have friends when you go to practice every single day. So that was the silver lining for sure.
Yeah, nice. And what about like food as a kid growing up? So what was food like in your household?
Food was very normalized. I don't have a lot of positive or negative memories, which I think is a good thing.
Yep.
I was a very picky eater compared to my brother and my sister. I was not keen to try new foods. I really just stuck to what I knew. And I didn't start thinking about food in a negative or positive way probably until I was around 12 or 13 and entered the middle school phase of life, which is kind of brutal. And that's when I kind of started to think about food and be like, oh, like maybe it's something I should care about. And that's when those thoughts kind of started in my head.
Yeah. And so you being a picky eater, how was that handled by your parents? Were you being forced to eat things you didn't want to eat, or they were pretty accommodating to making things that you would eat?
They were accommodating, but they also were tough in a good way, you know, kind of don't leave the table until you try your green beans type of thing. And they definitely encouraged me a lot to just take like one bite of a new food or try something different at a restaurant that might be prepared in a different style. But when I think back to my picky eating nature, it wasn't about different kinds of foods. It was more like a texture problem. I really was sensitive to different textures of foods. So, and that really carried on until I was probably 15. I was just so hesitant to try new things.
Yeah.
But yeah, and at a certain point, I think my parents, when I got older, like 12, 13, they were just like, you know, she's going to eat what she's going to eat. And we just kind of have to work around it.
Yeah. Yeah. And so what then started to shift when you were in middle school with your eating?
In middle school, I hit puberty at a very early age in life. So I think I was going through my awkward phase of puberty way before my peers. So, you know, I was bigger. I mean, I'm 5'11". I was tall. I had muscle. I just looked so much different than my peers. And it made me very self-conscious. And I started looking at my body and thinking that it was wrong. I was like, wow, I'm too big. I'm too tall. This isn't right. So then I was thinking, you know, I work out a lot already. I already swim hours and hours a day per week, whatnot. So it's like, maybe I'm not eating right. But I had those thoughts and then I never really acted on it. I would still eat the same way, but I started to become really insecure about my body and compare myself to my peers.
And it's interesting, like a couple of things you said, like one, the fact that you went into puberty early, considering how much training you're doing. Because I think there's a lot of sort of girls that and going into their teenage years who, because of the level of training, aren't developing at a level that is advanced to their peers. They're behind their peers. It's not until they're 16 that they're getting their first period or that kind of thing. And so it's just interesting to hear that even with the training that you're doing, that still happened, and that the genetics were just there to mean that was still prioritized.
Yeah. And my mom and I were actually talking about it just the other week, how she as a parent felt so unprepared for me to reach that time of my life at a young age. And she was telling me she can only imagine as like a young, like 10, 11-year-old, how that must feel. And then, like you said, some girls don't go through that until they're 13, 14, 15. So it just was such a shock, I think, for me and my family to navigate that.
Yeah. And you said that also part of it was you were much bigger. And I wonder, like, when I think of swimmers, and maybe I'm kind of stereotyping here, but being taller or bigger is a real asset for being a swimmer. So I'm wondering if you were able to take any solace in the okay, this is going to be helpful for swimming, or that wasn't crossing your mind at that point.
I did take some solace in it. I knew my height was an advantage. I knew just the genetic makeup of my body. I've always been a muscular person. I knew that was super advantageous. Yeah. But then when I go into just my normal school life, it was a little bit harder because my body type was definitely the minority in my school. So swimming wise, I was okay with it and I could accept it, but it was kind of socially a little more difficult.
Okay. And was that an internal thing, or you were actually then having people bullying you, or there were comments? Like, what did it actually look like for you?
I had, definitely comments. I had one kid in 7th grade. He asked me if I was such a good swimmer, why my legs were so big, basically calling my legs fat. And he was like, how can you be a good swimmer if you look like that? Which was a tough comment to hear and receive.
Yeah.
And just, little things here and there that were tough. That was the only one I really, really remember that sticks out in my mind.
Okay. And what did the trajectory then look like in terms of you starting to make changes with your food, in terms of dieting or whatever was going on there, to it then taking it getting a lot worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I was 12 and 13, I was kind of insecure, struggling, but not really acting on anything. And then when I was 15 years old, one summer I was competing and I thought I was going to have this great summer and swim amazing, and I didn't. And I really internalized that poor performance and attributed it to my body, because I worked so hard. I trained so hard. I thought I was doing everything right. And I was like, well, maybe it is time to make a change. Maybe it's time I need to eat healthier. I need to care more. And I need to just pay attention to what I'm eating. And I think it started out very innocently, in the sense that my goal wasn't to calorie restrict in the beginning. It was to essentially make more mindful eating choices and maybe add a couple more vegetables here and there and eat whole grains, that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I really justified my eating habits in the beginning, being like, well, I'm making healthy decisions. That's just the kind of lifestyle I was pursuing. And that's what I told myself.
Okay. And how did those around you react to these changes? I'm getting a sense, like, if you're a picky eater and now you're saying, I'm going to have more vegetables, I'm going to have more of these, that there was probably a lot of celebration that this was the path you were now taking.
Yeah, I think there was definitely celebration. My parents, I will say, were supportive of every decision I made, really independently of, weight and health. They just were super supportive parents. So if I wanted to go buy whole grain bread, my mom was like, great, that's so good. Or if I wanted to buy like any other food, she would just support me in that. But the thing that the celebration came from was the weight loss that ensued from this healthy eating. I started to eat healthier and pay attention to what I was putting in my body. And I think pretty naturally, I lost a couple pounds, and other people in my life, like coaches and my peers, and even my friends' parents, started to comment and say, wow, you look so good. What are you doing? You look like you've lost weight. And that aspect of being celebrated for weight loss really fueled my drive to eat healthy, because it felt so good to have people tell me that I looked better.
Yeah. Which is just such a horrible thing to have happen, and to really cement that at that young age, and just to tell a 15-year-old, oh, you look really good, have you lost weight? Like, it's just not a comment that I want someone to make.
I 100% agree. And I'm 23 right now, and thinking as an adult, it's so sad to me that a parent would say something like that to a 15-year-old, because at 15, your body's supposed to be changing. Like, I don't think you're necessarily supposed to be losing weight at 15. I mean,
you're not. No,
I was still growing. Yeah. And it's just so unfortunate. I would understand it maybe if my peers said something, because, we're young teenagers and kids, but for a parent and a coach to say it, looking back, was super unfortunate.
Yeah. Yeah, because they're role models. They're like at age 15, your prefrontal cortex is not online in the way that it's going to be as you get older. And yeah, kids at that age make comments. And so it's, as you say, it's very different for that versus someone who is an adult who should be, yeah, complimenting you on lots of other things.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so where did it then go from there? Or what happened after that summer when you then started losing weight, you started getting compliments? What happened?
Mm-hmm. So that was the fall kind of when I was 15. It was fall time. And then in December, I had a swim meet, and it was a long course meet in the winter, which was kind of unusual, but it was because it was the Olympic year. It was leading into 2016.
Yeah.
So I went up to Washington, swam in this meet, and went a time that put me 7th in the nation going into the Olympic year, which was, I mean, I dropped like a 1.5 seconds. It was the swim that I knew I was capable of the summer prior, but it just happened in December. So swimming that time really, really shifted my focus, because I was like, wow, I could be a finalist at Olympic trials. Like I could be in striking distance of achieving some pretty cool things. And
Yeah.
it really shifted. Like, I think that was when my brain went, okay, we need to really go all in on this swimming thing. Like I thought of it as like my job. I was like, I'm going to train and eat and live as if swimming is my job.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which looking back, I would not recommend that for myself, because I was only 15 and 16. Like my job was to be a kid and a teenager. But yeah, I just had a very severe mental shift after that performance, which then led to the beginning of my restrictive eating, I think.
Yeah. Well, especially if this performance happens after you've started to change the way you eat, after you've lost weight, there becomes an association of, well, maybe the reason I'm doing this faster time is because I've lost weight, and is because I'm now paying this attention to my eating. And what if I then take it up a further notch? Where could we go from there?
Yes, you hit the nail on the head. I totally thought that my performance was because of how I had been eating and the changes I had made, which is also ironic, because thinking back to when I was eating at that time, I wasn't eating like completely 100% healthy. Like I still had great variety, and I think the day I went that really good swim, I shared like a bag of donut holes with my sister, which is just something you don't think of when you think of performing. But I definitely thought that, wow, okay, like I've made these changes, so I need to like step it up to continue to do better.
Yeah. And so then what happened from there?
What happened from there is I started, going towards this Olympic trial year, and swimming was just kind of picking up. It was becoming more and more of a really dedicated part of my life. And I remember I started cutting foods out. I started thinking, well, I don't need this. Like, this isn't necessary for my diet.
Yeah.
And thinking about like after practice, I trained from anywhere from 5 to 8 p.m. or 6 to 9 p.m. So right in the middle of dinner, really awkward time to be training. So my post-workout meal / snack, I kind of started cutting that down. I was like, well, I don't need this. Like, I'm not that hungry. And then it would become a routine. And I'm a very habitual person, even to this day. So when I started cutting something out from like my post-practice snack, I wouldn't add it back in, because it became a habit of me not to have it. So it was very slow, very incremental that I started becoming restrictive. And I don't even think I realized it at the time. I was just justifying reasons why I didn't need all of these little items throughout the day.
Yeah. And I mean, what you're describing is so common with an eating disorder. It's just this this iteration where you keep creating a new normal. And if I ate less yesterday, well, that's now the new normal, and I can't eat more today. And maybe it felt more gradual when you were doing it, but a lot of the time with clients, it can be like, I did this for one day and now that is my new normal. Or I started my exercise, that increased, and I did that for one day, and now that is the new norm. And there's this real asymmetry where my food can come down and that becomes the new norm, but going in the opposite direction, I can't do that in the same way. And the same with exercise. I can increase it, and I can increase it in a very short amount of time, but to go in the opposite direction is just such a challenge.
Yeah. And I definitely found myself in that kind of scenario down the line. And especially the last couple months of life before I was diagnosed with my eating disorder, it was kind of more of a steep decline of me just being so rigid and not being able to escape my bubble of safety that I had created in terms of food and exercise.
Yeah. And so when did that, like, how did you figure this out? Like, was it a coach who pointed this out? Was it your parents? Was it you who realized, okay, there's something that's amiss here? Like, how did it kind of reach that point?
It's a long story over many months, but the short version kind of is I was the summer that I was 17. So kind of two plus years after I shifted my eating habits and it kind of was dwindling into an eating disorder, I had mono over this whole summer. So I was tired, I was fatigued. I mean, the symptoms that come along with mono are very different, and I think fatigue was a huge one for me. So my swimming was being affected for sure, but I still was training every single day. I didn't even take a break when I had mono. I was just kind of grinding on swimming. And I swam at the end of the summer in Long Island, New York. I was trying to qualify for the national team for the second year. And it reached a point where I was unable to basically get down the pool. I was so fatigued. I was so weak that some of my coaching staff that was not a part of my club team, it was more of like the USA coaching staff, and my mom, they encouraged me to go to the hospital to get my blood work done. So I did that. And then at that point, we decided it wasn't worth it for me to continue competing. So I flew home. And then my mom got a call one morning at like 4 a.m. and it was the cardiologist from this hospital. And he called my mom and he said, your daughter's heart rate when she was in the emergency room was like scarily low. He said, with athletes, there is this range of normalcy for athletes to have low heart rates, but your daughter's was low, and he encouraged that we get it checked out. And that actually was the catalyst to my mom kind of connecting the dots that I probably had an eating disorder. She had seen my rigidity around food. She had noticed the weight loss. And I think this heart rate situation I was experiencing was kind of the final straw to where she realized, okay, something is totally not right. But I would like to say, I don't think anyone in my life knew that I had an eating disorder because stereotypically I was not underweight. Like I was not kind of visibly, you wouldn't think of me having a problem with eating, which is why I think it took so long for everyone to figure out that I was struggling with an eating disorder.
Yeah. And this is one of the things I cover often on the podcast is that eating disorders don't look a certain way. You can have people in all body sizes and shapes who are just struggling with an eating disorder. And it can be very easy, especially for an athlete, to just chalk up lots of different issues that are going on to anything but an eating disorder. Like you were talking about how much training you were doing. Like when you said I was diagnosed with mono the before this, I don't know what the diagnostic criteria is for mono or how that's diagnosed. And I'm wondering, like, was that actually mono, or is it you're just so depleted because of what you've been doing with food and exercise?
Yeah, I agree. I think that I probably had the effects of mono. I was diagnosed with it in like April or May. I think I probably was sick for a while, but I think the continuation of my horrible symptoms was a direct result to how malnourished I was. But I just didn't realize it because I thought I was just sick. So it was definitely covered up in my mind.
Yeah. And when your mom is putting these dots together, where are you in terms of putting these dots together? Like at the point that she's coming to this conclusion, are you also already there?
I was so far deep into a hole of denial at the time. I thought that there was no way that I had an eating disorder because I ate 3 meals a day. I had a couple snacks. And I was so caught up in the stereotypes. Like,
Yeah.
I didn't look at myself and see someone who had an eating disorder. I thought that to have an eating disorder, you didn't eat at all. I just thought there was no way. And it wasn't until I was hospitalized for the first time that I really began to want to understand how I could have had an eating disorder.
Okay. And speak more about that in terms of, because I'm seeing this as having an effect on my swimming, and this is such a big part of my identity, and I need to understand this so I can get back to swimming.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think I was so shocked when I learned that I had an eating disorder, and I was so unwilling to step back from swimming. I was very unwilling to miss training and to devote some of my attention to my new diagnosis of an eating disorder that I didn't think it was that big of a deal. I didn't think it was something that needed to be addressed.
Yeah.
And then when I was hospitalized and they told me for my first hospitalization that I needed to be there for 3 weeks to be medically stabilized, that was the first time that I was like, whoa. I was like, this is a way bigger issue than I thought it was. If I had to be in the hospital for 3 weeks, I really started just giving myself permission to listen to the doctors and to meet with a therapist and to understand that what I was doing wasn't healthy, because I just thought I was being healthy most of the time. And I needed to understand how my behaviors and my thoughts were actually very unhealthy. I needed to grasp that.
Yeah. And once there was that 3 week stay, which you said sort of crystallized that idea, were you able to then really get on board with that idea, or there was still, I don't know, many years of ambivalence around the fact that, is this really an eating disorder? How much was that just then cemented, like, oh, this is really a problem and I need to work on this?
I knew it was a problem for sure, but it wasn't until I left that I realized how tricky and complicated eating disorders were. Because before my hospital stay, my eating disorder had never been challenged. No one had ever tried to address it, to fight it, to deal with it, including me. So then when I got out of the hospital, my parents and my new outpatient treatment team, they were fighting my eating disorder, and I was trying to fight my eating disorder, which made my eating disorder very angry.
Yeah.
And I didn't know what to do with that. I felt like I really wanted to go back to my old habits and my old life, but I don't think I could have ever gone back to pre-diagnosis life. So I ended up having another 2-week hospital stay a couple months later before going into my first round of treatment at the University of San Diego Eating Disorder Center. And I spent basically probably 5 months doing PHP and IOP to really try to address
what's PHP and IOP, just for the listeners?
Partial hospitalization. So I did at UCSD, I did the 10-hour and the 6-hour. and IOP is inpatient or intensive outpatient. And that was 3 hours. So I would go to a clinic and I would be there for 10 or 6 or 3 hours per day over my length at the program. And it was, they gave you meals. So it was like you had your meals there. You had a variety of different therapies. I had individual therapy. I also had family therapy because my first time in treatment, I was a minor and it was family-based at that program. So it was a very all-inclusive, well-rounded approach to address my eating disorder, for sure.
Nice. And how well did that work? Where did it get you by having that level of care?
I want to preface this by saying I think the program is amazing. And it was an amazing program. I was not the best patient. I still struggled with accepting that I had to deal with it. I wanted to take shortcuts. I wanted to kind of cheat the system a lot, which only led to relapse. And I think if you want to cheat, there is no cheating the system when you're recovering from an eating disorder.
No, there really isn't. Like I was having a call with a client today about this as well. I'm just talking like you can find your way into an eating disorder where you kind of stumble your way in there, which is often most people's stories. You don't do that on the way out. Like you genuinely have to put in the work and be very conscious about doing all the things to have recovery occur.
Oh, 100%. And I thought that I had to check the boxes. You check the boxes, you do what they want you to do in program, you get discharged, and then life will be fine. And I think I got discharged in June before I went to the University of Georgia to swim. And over the summer, I was holding my own. I was managing, and it wasn't great, but it wasn't awful. And going to college was another huge life transition, and my eating disorder did not handle that life transition that well. Yeah. And I found myself in another relapse, which I think looking back probably happened, like I said, because I was trying to shortcut actually addressing my eating disorder. And because I didn't go full in on treatment the first time, it led to my eating disorder kind of resurging.
Yeah. And there was something you said earlier that I want to highlight because I think it's really important. You said it was when I had to then start challenging my eating disorder that I sort of realized it was such a problem. And I think this is such a big thing because when you're saying, hey, I'm doing healthy eating and I think healthy eating is great, and you're just doing all the things that are basically eating disorder aligned, and you're saying, and this is the way that I want to live, like it's hard to notice that there's a problem because you're not knocking up against anything. It's only when you're like, and now I want to go and challenge myself. Like now I want to eat X food, or I want to have X number of rest days a week. And this is doing something that is in opposition to the eating disorder that you suddenly realize, oh, okay, I'm not in the driver's seat in the way that I think I am.
100%. And that was a defining factor for a lot of my recovery journey. Is I faced a lot of like program stuff and just therapy stuff that really, really challenged me. And I struggled with that because I was not in control. Yeah.
And what was going on in terms of like the coaching at this point? So with the swim coaching, was your coach like all throughout this? Were they raising red flags or concerned? And then when you did come back to start swimming again, was it taken on board? Like, this is your history. We need to do something different because this is your history. Like, how was this dealt with from a coaching perspective?
So my club coach when I was in California did not ever raise concerns. He saw more of the symptom side. He was always asking me why I was so tired. And, I had a lot of like mood struggles. I would be very anxious and very sad and very upset because I couldn't train the way I wanted to because I was so malnourished, which I didn't know at the time, but I do now.
Yeah.
And so he kind of addressed those concerns, like, why are you so tired? And I would tell him, I don't know why I'm so tired. But then when I left club swimming in California and came to Georgia, I had told my head coach that I was diagnosed with an eating disorder, and they connected me with a full treatment team before I got to campus as a freshman. So I had a doctor, a psychiatrist, a nutritionist, and a therapist who kind of all worked together to oversee my care when I was at the university.
Okay, nice. And is that because you were like a national swim team hopeful, or because you were on a scholarship? Like, is that offered to everyone who's at Georgia University? Like, how did this, like, or could be offered to anyone at Georgia University if they have a history of an eating disorder?
I'm pretty sure my treatment team would be available to any athlete at the university. So it was all athletics based.
Okay.
So through the athletic association, they had kind of their own staff. They did have to connect me. They had to refer out to a eating disorder therapist. She kind of worked in tandem with the athletic association, but she wasn't a staff member at UGA. So they do have a very robust and great program for mental health needs and resources at the university. So I was very lucky to be able to have that already in place.
Nice. And how were you with talking about this with people outside of your team? And this could be still when you were at school, and then when you went to university. Like, did your friends know? Did no one know? What was this like in terms of you talking about it?
When I finally accepted that I had an eating disorder, I kept it. It was like, I tried to have it be the best kept secret I ever had. Okay. I wanted no one to know. And that came from a lot of shame and embarrassment that I felt around it.
Yeah.
So I think it was mainly my family and my coaching staff, and really need to know type of basis. Yeah. And, that was back in 2018. So there was still a lot of unknowns around eating disorders and stigmas and stereotypes. And I was really scared of having that affect people's perception of me. So I kept it very secretive.
Yeah. And I'm also thinking about social media and the impact that it could have. So I'm 41, you're 23. So there's a big age gap. And I've commented on the podcast many times before, like, I wouldn't want to be a teenager in this day and age. Like, I hated so many aspects of school, and there was we were at the very early stages of the internet. There was no social media. There was none of this in the mid 90s. And so just how much was that also having an impact on you and sort of connected to all of this?
Social media, growing up with it, is really tough. And yeah. I will say it kind of goes back to what I was talking about before, where my body type was just kind of different. And I wanted so badly to be the type of girl that I saw on Instagram. When I would go to the gym, I would do extra, this was in high school, I would do extra workouts on top of swimming. And I'd go on the gym and go on the elliptical, and I'd watch runway shows of like high fashion runway models. And I'd just dream of looking like that, which is so sad because my body type was so good for swimming, and it was built the way that I was meant to be. But, on social media, I saw this different body type, and I wanted to be like it so bad. But connecting it to kind of my eating disorder, I Especially when I reached recovery and weight restoration, man, social media was hard because I did not want to be in any pictures. I just my whole mindset changed because I was changing, my body was changing, and it was really, really tough.
Yeah. And it's really interesting to hear you say, okay, I was looking at fashion models on Instagram or watching that while I was at the gym, because undoubtedly there would have been people who were looking at you thinking, wow, like she is swimming so quickly, she's potentially heading to the Olympics, like that is my dream, why doesn't my body match up to her body? And it's that thing of like turtles all the way down, like everyone has that experience of looking at someone else and thinking, gosh, why can't I have that thing that that person has?
Yeah. And I even do that with myself. I will see pictures of myself from these times in my life, like, and I'll think, why did I ever look at myself and think such negative things? Because now I can see with clear eyes. And I just wish I could have had my mindset that I do now back then, because it just is so easy to wish for what you don't have. But like you said, you made a great point that, yeah, someone could have been looking at me and saw something, or I could look at someone else and see something that they don't see. So it's so subjective.
Yeah, definitely. And I do I think eating disorders are multifactorial, and there's many driving factors. And I mean, you've already touched on a number of them, but are there other things that we haven't talked about that you think were sort of pushing you towards this or made you more susceptible to this?
I I don't know. I personally like to think that just my personality, and I don't know if there's any science behind this, but I think my personality as a kid, I was so introverted, so shy. Like I said, picky eater. And one of the main driving things is anxiety. I've had anxiety my whole entire life. And I think my anxious nature was a huge underlying factor in the development of my eating disorder.
Yeah. Well, look, there is research around this about the fact that personality type and genetic traits connected to either sensitivity or anxiety is very much linked to an eating disorder. And this is something I talk about a lot with clients is I think eating disorders are anxiety disorders. And I had Sasha Gorel on the podcast. I'll link to it in the show notes for anyone who wants to listen to that. And we talked about this for a whole episode about the fact that eating disorders are anxiety disorders. And the thing with all anxiety disorders is it's about avoidance. And the thing that helps all anxiety disorders is exposure, which is kind of doing the thing that you're scared of. And that's why eating disorder treatment, yes, it's about nutritional rehabilitation, and that's a really important part. And it's also about doing the thing that you're afraid of and doing it enough and doing it in the right way with the right support, etc., so that you get to a place where either that thing doesn't scare me anymore or that thing still makes me uncomfortable. And I also know that I can do it even when that uncomfortable feeling is still here.
Yeah, that just you saying that brought me back to so many times when I felt that. And that's something that I think I opposed, but now I really appreciate that I went through that, kind of exposing myself to all of these things for such a long time that I was so fearful of, that now I'm able to sit here and be so much more open-minded and so much less fearful.
Yeah. Yeah. And so I think in terms of your story, at the point you've got up to, you've kind of gone off to university, you're then having this relapse at that point. So then what happens from there?
Yeah, this part of my story is probably one of the most tumultuous times. I went to university and started relapsing in my first semester. And it was a way quicker relapse than the beginning stages of my eating disorder. And I had lost a significant amount of weight and was engaging in behaviors and things that I am not proud of today, but I realized that it was a direct result of my eating disorder. And I came home for Christmas break and was kind of knocking at death's door, to put it bluntly. My body was just so broken down and it couldn't sustain itself. So I went back into the hospital for 5 weeks, and that hospital stay was way different for me because it was at a different program than I was at the first time. And it was very sobering to sit in the hospital and realize how awful my health was at that point in life. And that, more than anything, was the biggest wake-up call that I experienced with my eating disorder.
And wake-up call for what reason? I know that sounds like a dumb question, but what was it about that?
Just realizing that my eating disorder could 100% kill me if I kept living my life the way that I was. Because I think before I was like, yeah, eating disorders are dangerous. I knew they were dangerous, but I felt like it would never happen to me. I felt like, oh, I'll never be one to die from it, or it'll never be that bad. And then when I went to the hospital that time, I was like, oh my gosh, like it did happen to me. Like it is that bad. And it really shifted how I thought about addressing it and how I thought about taking it on in terms of recovering. And yeah, it was just such a heartbreaking experience thinking about it now for me and for my family and everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think there is so much grief around eating disorders and eating disorder recovery. It is one of those emotions that comes up a lot connected to this.
Mm-hmm. Grief in so many different ways. You know, I've experienced grieving so much within my journey, and just looking back now, when I was in my eating disorder, really in the thick of it, I didn't have regard for what my supporting people in my life were going through, like how it affected my parents, how it affected my siblings. I just wasn't in the mind frame to think about that.
Yeah.
But man, eating disorders are hard for loved ones to see other people suffer with it. Like I have so much love and respect for my family for fighting the fight with me when it was really bad.
Yeah. And so in tangible terms, like what happened from here? Like you said, it felt like, okay, this sort of galvanized you to say, I'm going to take on my recovery. And so what did that then look like?
It looked like going back to UCSD, Eating Disorder Center, but I was in the adult program, which was so much better suited for me because it was up to me. All of the decisions I made were like, it was my doing what I wanted to accomplish. So I really I think I accepted it. I was like, okay, I have these 5 months to do nothing else but address this eating disorder.
Yeah.
And I was going to weight restore and I was going to do it. And my gosh, what's it called? My weight restoration goal and my calorie intake each day was just astronomical, but I kind of had to take it day by day and go, okay, like whatever I was doing before in my eating disorder, I had to accept that it was not what was best for me. Despite how loud my eating disorder was, it just wasn't. So I did another round of treatment, and then my recovery journey is way longer than that because that was back in 2019. Obviously, it didn't just like end there with a nice little bow. Yeah. But that was my last time in treatment. And ever since that treatment stay, I've been able to move through recovery at an outpatient level.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think the thing that stands out for me there is you talking about like, I then took responsibility. I then started to choose this. And I think
Mhm.
that really does make all the difference because, yes, you can give someone more energy and yes, they can have an impact on them in terms of that has an impact on their physiology. But if
Mhm.
they aren't choosing that and they don't want it, it is just I am counting down the days until I'm out
Mhm.
of here and I get to do the things that I want to be able to do. And so I
Yeah.
think like yeah, I'm a huge advocate of you need nutritional rehabilitation. Like hands down, the most important thing as part of recovery. Like everything else pales in comparison, and someone needs to also be choosing that that is what they're doing.
Yes, I have a lot of athletes and younger people that reach out to me sometimes and they ask about advice for treatment or for eating disorders, and I always tell them it has to come from you at the end of the
Yeah,
day. Like your parents could want it for you, your coaches could want it for you, but I just don't think you can find true recovery, and you can't strive for true recovery unless you have that desire to do it from within.
yeah, yeah, I agree. And look, this isn't to say that any parent should then say, well, they can just do what they want to do. Like if I was a parent, I would be wanting to do the like family-based treatment. I would be wanting to do everything in my power to try
Yep.
and support my child with this. And at the same time, knowing that things really only stick when that person decides, okay, I'm going to do this.
Mm-hmm. 100%.
Yeah. And so what then happened after that in terms of swimming?
So swimming was still on the table, which honestly is wild to think about. I probably should have stopped way sooner to deal with my eating disorder,
Yeah.
but I was determined to swim and went back to swim for my sophomore year. And a month into sophomore year, September, it was a couple weeks before my first competition, what was going to be my first. And I actually tore my ACL, a little bit of plot twist to
Yeah.
my trajectory. And the combination of 2 years of eating disorder treatment plus now facing surgery and rehab for an ACL, I kind of took that as the opportunity to look at my life and say swimming wasn't what was best for me anymore,
Okay.
which was probably one of the best decisions I've ever made, because my eating disorder, kind of connecting it back to what we were talking about with anxiety, I think my eating disorder really started to gear up because I had anxiety about my performance and about my preparation. I didn't have a lot of trust in the training I was doing. So it led me to focus on my eating. And because my eating disorder was so tied and intertwined with swimming, I think I needed to step back from swimming to fully recover and address my eating disorder.
Yeah. And it's interesting, and we'll get onto this in terms of Victoria Garrick is the person who set up the Hidden Opponent, and I watched her TED talk, and she talks about in that like the difference between a physical injury and then like a mental health injury, and that
Mhm.
how those things are viewed differently. And I wonder even if they were viewed differently for you, where if I give up swimming because of an eating disorder, that feels very different to me giving up swimming because I've done my ACL and there's now this physical thing that is tied to this that, I don't know, it feels more legitimate or it just feels different.
It was so funny you mentioned that because I think there's a lot of truth to it. When I tore my ACL, I I think it helped me that I could medically retire because of my eating disorder. Like, as
Yeah.
much as I would love to say it was because of my ACL, I definitely could have rehabbed the ACL and moved on and swam. But it was just the right time for me to say, you know what, with how my life had had gone the last couple of years, like it gave me the motivation to make that step.
Yeah. And how at peace are you with that decision, and how things did turn out in terms of swimming? Because I can imagine there could be a lot of regret about this. And also there is like, okay, this is now opening up my life to all of these other possibilities. So like, how do you think about this?
I have no regrets. And my journey post swimming was very up and down. So I had surgery for my ACL, which kind of began my kind of full recovery journey in terms of physical and mental. And I went through a grieving period, which is what I call it. I call it my swimming grieving period, where
Yeah.
I allowed myself to be super bummed out because there was no way around it. There was no way to shortcut the sadness that came along with losing the sport and missing out on all of the dreams and goals that I had set for myself. And then I kind of went on this a little bit of a roller coaster ride with my eating disorder recovery and journey. You know, I had to learn how to fuel myself again after, because I wasn't swimming. So I struggled with like emotional eating and then kind of the binge restrict cycle. And I had to navigate all these little tiny nuances to my recovery.
Yeah.
But ultimately, it all led me to where I am today, which is I still pay very close attention to making sure I'm eating enough, because that's very important for me. I have to be somewhat regimented and make sure I'm eating consistently and enough. But I'm discovering intuitive eating and learning how to listen to my body and all of those things I wouldn't have been able to do if I didn't experience the more negative side of, like I said, like binge restrict and emotional eating, because it gave me the opportunity to work through a lot of thoughts and emotions.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder as well, like you talk about discovering intuitive eating and listening to my body. And I love the fact that that's where you're at. And like how different that may have been. And you tell me what your experience was like, but how different that was to your training. Like, is it that actually I'm feeling tired? Well, you just push through. Or I feel sore. Okay, you just push through. Like where actually it's I don't listen to my body.
Yeah, it's so different. And like I said, it's time that kind of adjusted me to all of it. Like with swimming, in every aspect of my life, you had to be extremely disciplined and regimented, and you had to have a plan.
Yeah.
And that definitely carried over into my recovery, where for years and years, I lived my life following meal plans from my dietitian, and I was super regimented because I was afraid of falling into a place of relapse.
Yeah.
But now, you know, I'm starting to realize it's okay for me where I am at now. Like if I want to go have a big lunch, I don't have to feel confined to have a snack. Like I can play around with how I eat and what I eat, because I trust my brain, and I think my brain trusts my body. And all of those inner workings, there's just so much more trust within myself to make those decisions, which is so liberating. I never thought that I would get to a place where I could make these kind of free decisions around food.
Nice. That is so lovely to hear. And it does, like, it takes time to get there. Like, I think if you try to do this early on, it's a recipe for disaster, because you're just not getting good quality feedback from your body, or your ability to discern the information that you're getting back is so messed up. Because when you've known like true stomach gnawing hunger, anything less than that feels like I'm not hungry. And so it's either like a 0 out of 10 or a 10 out of 10, and then there's nothing else in between. And so it does, as you say, it takes time for you to be able to build up your nuance in ability of discerning these different things.
Yes. And I think, like you mentioned, when I was really deep into my eating disorder, I had no hunger cues. My body was so out of tune that if I would have tried to pursue any level of intuitive eating, I wouldn't have been able to because
Yeah.
my body would have told me I wasn't hungry, which is
Yeah.
super dangerous.
Yeah.
So I think more than anything, I needed to ensure that my body was healed kind of hormonally and physically to where it could tell me what it felt and I could listen to it.
Yeah. And what about the identity piece? Like I have so many clients or people I speak to who like exercise is a big part of their life, and they're part of the ultra running community, or they're part of the tennis community, and tennis is a whole big part of their life. And like clearly there are benefits to this sense of community,
Yeah.
but it's also based around an activity that is problematic because of their eating disorder. So how did you navigate like moving away from swimming and losing this part of your identity and maybe losing friends? Like what happened, and how did you navigate it?
Yeah, I definitely experienced all of that. Definitely lost friends, lost swimming, lot of loss. But I kind of made this decision that during COVID, because my retirement kind of aligned with COVID, I just allowed myself to not do any type of exercise. I was
Yeah.
like, if there's going to be a time in my life where I could explore not exercising, it is right now. So I probably went 6 months, and I do like walks, and I do very kind of low intensity and joyful movement,
Yeah.
but nothing that I would have previously considered exercise. And that I know not everyone kind of would think this is a great idea, but taking a long break from exercise was such a good perspective adjustment for me. It changed how I viewed exercise and what I wanted to do. And I had time to pursue other passions. I joined a church, and I found my faith, and I spent time with friends and family, which is something I hadn't done in years and years. So stopping movement allowed me to find other avenues of community and passion that weren't connected to exercise.
Nice. I'm glad to hear that, and I would second that. Like that is something that I will often recommend and work on with clients, is having a period of break. And I think for all the reasons that you listed, as well as so often exercise is how I cope, how I deal with my emotions. And again, I don't think there's anything inherently wrong with that. But if that's someone's go-to and really their only way, then I think it
Mhm.
is a problem, especially if someone has a tendency to develop an eating disorder. And so having that clean break where as you say, I had 6 months where I wasn't doing that, it means that you really do start to develop other coping skills.
Yeah, that's a great point. I 100% developed so many different coping skills, and I learned to lean on my support system more. And that was the biggest thing, is where before I would turn to my eating disorder or I would turn to exercise, I started to just talk to people and seek support and advice from loved ones. So it was a really, really valued time for me in terms of my recovery, those 6 months.
Yeah. And were you like prior to this, and I don't like maybe when you were 15 or 17, like if you were introducing yourself, like how quickly did I'm a swimmer come up? Like how much was your identity based around this?
Oh, it was everything and more a part
Okay.
of my it was like if there was a number greater than 100%, it would have been that. Because I didn't do anything else besides swimming. I mean, I hate to say it, but I didn't even really care about school
Yeah.
because I just thought I wanted to be this amazing swimmer. So it was I was 100% just a swimmer that whole time. And while I don't necessarily, that's a lie. I do regret that, but I just don't think I was in a position to challenge it or change it back in the day.
Yeah.
I think it was what it was back then. But now it's so cool to not just be one thing. It's cool to have many different sides of my identity.
Yeah. And I don't know, like I'm not in the world of elite athletes, especially athletes who are looking at going to the Olympics. Like I don't know how realistic it is for someone to be in the Olympics and say, I have a really well-balanced, well-rounded life. Like I don't know if those two things are compatible.
Yeah, I agree. I think at a certain stage they're not compatible.
Yes.
What I have reflected on is when I was 15 to 17, I was trying to live the life of an athlete who was like 26.
Okay.
So I always tell, like, any parent that I talk to, I say, as long as your kid's under 18, I would strive to live as balanced of a life as possible. I know there's definitely kind of discrepancies here and there, but because when you're 18 and you go to college, then you can dive head into your sport. You are an adult, you have more time, and I just think it's super important for high school and middle school aged athletes to try to keep some sense of normalcy.
Yeah. And it's interesting. Like I reflect on my growing up, and I played sport all through school. Never at any great level of like I'm going to make a national team or anything along those lines. It was always just fun, and yeah, it was always just fun. Like we would train maybe once a week, maybe twice a week. We'd then play on the weekend, one game on the weekend, and that was kind of it. And it just, I don't know if it's just the level that you got to, or actually there's been a shift, but it feels like there is this shift where if you're going to play sport, you then end up like dedicating 20 hours a week to this thing, as opposed to, oh yeah, I play a little bit of football, or I play a little bit of cricket, or I play a little bit of rugby, or whatever it may be, and that's just it.
Mm-hmm. There is a huge shift, I think, of early specialization in sport, but then also just trying to pursue a level of sport and of practice that is so unattainable for a young person. And yeah, I totally would recommend, like, if you want to practice, every day, I think that's totally fine. But I lived a lifestyle where I wouldn't go to school dances and I wouldn't hang out with friends and go get food late at night because I was super regimented, where if I could tell my younger self, I'd be like, yeah, skip a couple practices, like go get some cheeseburgers at night and go to a school dance. Like all of those things are so fun, and it definitely would have prevented burnout. And I think those things prevent burnout for a lot of young athletes.
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting, like, there's a book called Range by, I think it's David Epstein. Have you come across that?
I haven't.
So his big thing is just talking about the benefits of having a range of activities that you do. And he talked about, like, the first chapter compares Tiger Woods, who is just this phenomenal golfer who from like age, I don't know, as soon as he could walk, he was picking up a golf club. His dad was a fanatical golfer, and he would just like play golf, smashing the ball into the garage door where they got a mat up. And like Tiger Woods was always on the path to being like a phenomenal golfer, and all he ever did was play golf. And it's kind of like no surprise with his kind of talent plus the amount that he trained that he got there. And then he compares it to Roger Federer, who is a phenomenal tennis player, sort of Tiger Woods' equal in tennis, and yet Federer played all of these different sports. And it wasn't until much later that he then narrowed down and was like, okay, tennis is my thing. And the book just makes this example in like all of these different areas, whether it's playing an instrument, where it's like critical thinking, like how important it is not just to get your 10,000 hours, but to have all of these extra areas that help in terms of like quality of life. But he looked at the people who were winning Nobel Prizes in science, like how many of them were also painters or artists, and how all of these things kind of meld together to make it really just how helpful all of these things are. And it is definitely something I've taken on board.
Yeah, I love that. That's a super interesting kind of perspective of, I didn't know that about Roger Federer. And it reminded me of Michael Phelps. You know, he was more aligned with Tiger Woods, where he was a through and through. But there's so many different paths to excellence. There's so many different paths to success. And I think that's often forgotten in sport.
Yeah. Well, I think the other part is like, maybe there are some sports where you have to do that if you're going to be the Michael Phelps. And that's not why everyone is playing sport.
Yeah,
like,
exactly.
It can be very much like, I just enjoy doing this thing. I don't need to be training 30 hours a week.
Yes, 100%.
Yeah. And so I know you're currently pursuing a master's degree in sports management and policy at Georgia. Like, was that what you were already studying before you retired, or was there a change in direction?
There was a change in direction. I took my newfound freedom of not being tied down to sport for a lot of time, and really turned that into a love of what I was studying and a love of academics. And Georgia has a great program where you can do your undergrad degree and your master's degree in 5 years. So I'm towards the tail end of that path, but they have a sport management degree, which kind of combines my love of school and my love of sport.
Yeah.
And it's been super gratifying and really fun.
Nice. And is this also then how you became connected with the hidden opponent?
Becoming connected to the hidden opponent was more of just a personal thing. I followed Victoria for a while, and when she launched the hidden opponent back in 2019, I had submitted my story to be shared on their Instagram. And then when they were launching our campus captains program, they were looking for athletes to kind of lead the groups that were being set up. So I applied to be a head, and that's how I met everyone there. And I now work kind of on the leadership side. I do social media and kind of outreach stuff like that. So it's been almost 3 years now that I've been with them.
Nice. And if we take a step back for listeners who are unaware of the hidden opponent, can you talk about what it is?
Of course. So like you said, Victoria Garrick, she did this TED Talk, and it was called, there's the hidden opponent in it, like facing the hidden opponent. And she took that TED Talk that got a lot of views and a lot of traction and turned it into this nonprofit where our mission is to give support and to advocate and to educate student athletes and really all sport professionals about mental health and how to break the stigma in athletics, because mental health in athletics has been such a hush-hush topic. No one really wanted to talk about it. It wasn't a really respected topic to even engage in sport. And it's just now in the last, I would say, 5 years that it's being talked about and people are paying more attention to the mental health of athletes.
Yeah.
So Victoria created it, and Leanne Pissarro is our chief operating officer, and they created a campus captains program where we now have, I think, over 800 university students who are athletes that advocate on behalf of the hidden opponent, which is so amazing. And I think we're so lucky to have athletes who want to break the stigma.
Nice. And when she set this up, because I know Phelps has done a documentary basically about his mental health struggles, especially like post Olympics. Had that already come out, or is that after this?
So are you talking about The Weight of Gold?
Yes. Yes.
I'm pretty sure The Weight of Gold came out a few years later.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. But that was a great documentary.
Yeah. I still, it's still on my like to watch list. I haven't been able to see it. I've seen the trailer and I knew he's done it, and I've heard him on podcasts talking about it.
Yeah, but so definitely the weight of gold was later, but Victoria actually had a great opportunity to connect with Kobe Bryant before he passed, and they were connected, and we were listed as a resource in his book Geese Are Never Swans, which is kind of a mental health book, and I definitely recommend it for anyone who wants to read it. But she kind of had that great connection with Kobe, and Kobe was a champion of mental health as well. So we've definitely grown a lot in the last couple of years, and I think we will keep growing because mental health in sport continues to be a growing topic. I think people are more and more invested in helping student athletes find resources and education about a variety of mental health topics.
Yeah. And I wanted to go through a couple of things that Victoria Garrick mentioned in her TED Talk, because I watched it and I thought it was great and also really relevant to what we're talking about today. But I could see then how she then went and set up the hidden opponent. And she talked about her schedule at school and just showed how full her load is and was. And so she plays volleyball, and she was like talking about how she played volleyball and then she'd have these classes and like showed what her week looked like. And it was just so jam-packed. And she said, I was just so depleted. And then later comments, and I told myself I was weak for needing a break. And I think this just really struck me, because I think so much of mental health is from being just depleted and not getting the downtime and the space and the rest that is needed. And this is true whether you're a college student, but it can also be true with the mom who's got 3 kids who's still trying to make it to CrossFit classes 3 times a week or 5 times a week or whatever. There is so much going on, and the body is just not getting the rest that it needs, and the mind is just not getting the rest that it needs.
And it's great that Victoria kind of mentioned oftentimes we feel guilty for needing that break, because especially kind of tying in social media, there's so much of like a hustle culture where people are praised and lifted up if they are just absolutely jam-packing their schedule and accomplishing so many things. So especially in the athletic space, you're kind of prescribed this schedule at college of school and swim and rehab and all of the different meetings you need. And if you need a break, I think people kind of look at you funny. They're like, what do you mean you need a break? This is what you do.
Yeah.
But it's just so important to mention that each individual, each athlete is different. And I think that's something that might be missing from the athletic culture is, even though there is this set schedule and set mold for success at universities, there should be wiggle room for athletes who need a break, who need a different schedule, who have different needs. It's so important to honor that.
Yeah. And also, like, when I was looking at it, I'm like, she's training like a professional athlete, but a professional athlete, that is their job. And that's all they're doing. They're not then doing 5 days of university on top of that as well.
I think people really don't, unless you're in the thick of it, like in the student athlete role, it's really hard to grasp how intense the day-to-day is, because especially at Georgia, a lot of colleges, hopefully colleges would pursue this, but the student athletes, you have to be academically disciplined. So just as much as you're putting in effort and dedication into your sport, you have to be putting that much dedication into your academics, which is a tough load to carry with both sides of your life.
Yeah, definitely. And I think there are some sports where you could maybe make the case for, if I can put up with this, then I can make a really good living and I'm like set for life. And then there's other sports that's like, this is never going to go anywhere apart from just you absolutely loving this thing. Like there is no financial windfall at the end of this for you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point. I'm taking a law class, a sport law class right now, and we talk a lot about that with college athletes. With football and basketball, a lot of athletes view college as a stepping stone to professional life, which is kind of the way it is. But for so many other student athletes, they're pursuing their sport in college because it's what they love to do, and it kind of is the final journey in this long road of sport. And that's why it's so important to give kind of resources and support to these kids who are just doing it out of the love of their hearts, and they're so passionate about it.
Yeah. Yeah. And I remember there's the Netflix documentary Cheer. Did you watch that at all?
I did. I don't know if I've watched all of it, but I have seen a few episodes.
Right. I have really mixed feelings about that because I can tell that these people really love cheering and love this. And they are just being trained and overtrained to the point where they're getting lifelong injuries. And there was a part of me was like, for what? Like, yes, you love this thing, and I get that. And at age 21, to do something that is permanent, that means you're unable to walk properly for the rest of your life. It felt like these people were very dispensable. And that the person who was running this thing was really wanting to win the medals and take the accolades and all of that. And these kids were just pawns to be able to do this.
Yeah. And that's kind of an interesting topic because that's how I felt when I retired. Is I could have kept swimming and my eating disorder probably would have kept coming back. And I kind of felt like, for what? Like, why would I keep swimming if it meant that my eating disorder was going to be with me for even longer? And I didn't want to pursue that path. So I think a lot of student athletes put their bodies, they put their health absolutely on the line in pursuit of excellence. And you see it, especially with football and the information and kind of awfulness about CTE and what multiple concussions can do to the body. And it's a really, really tough topic to try to balance playing your sport, but also protecting your future.
Yeah, it is. And I like, there is no easy answers with any of these things. And I think about the things that were important to me when I was younger and now how I think about them differently. And I do wonder if there is then a lot of that of like, wow, I really pushed myself when I was super young. And now as I'm older, I wish maybe that wasn't so encouraged, or I took a different path.
Yeah, I think a lot of people might find themselves in that scenario. I know I think that way about myself when I was a teenager. Like, I wish I didn't push myself as hard as I did. But the only way you can really avoid that is by keeping good people around you, and hopefully your coaches and support staff have your best interest at heart and not just your like athletic best interest, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know from just going through the hidden opponent content that it's not just aimed at the student athletes, it's also aimed at the coaching staff.
I think it was within this last year, we rolled out a coaches and professionals program where monthly our staff will do Zoom calls with, different professionals, whether it be like mental health professionals, therapists, nutritionists, athletic trainers, or coaches, and they talk about programming that's relevant to them and how they can support themselves and how they can support their student athletes. Because as much as student athletes can advocate on their own behalf, a lot of the times it takes coaches getting on board to change the culture within a program to be more conducive to healthy mental habits.
Yeah. Well, also as the student athlete, you are just one person. As the coach, you're seeing many people, and the coach
Yep.
has then hopefully been doing this for many, many years. So, like, if I'm thinking about your story, a coach who is well versed in eating disorders and maybe some of the early signs of it, this could have been picked up earlier. And as the role of the coach, like having that knowledge to pass on to the person who this is their first time dealing with this
Mhm.
thing, so they didn't know to look out for these red flags.
It's so great that you mentioned that, because I believe that through and through, that if people around me in my athletic spaces were more well versed on mental health and eating disorders, I for sure would like to think that I would have sought intervention at an earlier stage. So now, I mean, I think that even the coaches at Georgia, I mean, with my scenario, they're probably very eagle-eyed when it comes to eating disorders. You know, just having the experience of seeing athletes go through something and learning about it only better serves athletes in the future who might be dealing with it.
Yeah, yeah. And then another thing that Victoria shares in her TED talk was she pulled up a number of her old social media posts, and there were posts of her in photos with her friends, and they're laughing and they're having time, like a fun time. And then she explained like what was really going on with each of them and how inaccurate they were. So like one, she stayed at that party for 5 minutes and then left because she had anxiety. Another one, they took 50 of the photos so she could find the right one where she felt she looked good enough to actually post it. Another one, I think she said she spent the entirety of the evening in tears, like just this mismatch between what is shown on social media and actually what's going on in someone's life.
Yeah, and that is rampant today in social media. I think we now more than ever have just so much access into people's lives, but it's only the tip of the iceberg, because I think for majority people are only want to share the good. I mean, it's really hard and vulnerable to want to share the bad with a
Yeah.
public platform, which is totally understandable. But I think when athletes and really just people in general consume social media, you need to go into it with the expectation that you're only seeing a fraction of that person's life and that person's story. And I mean, I did that during treatment. I think like 3 weeks or a month after I got out of the hospital, I posted this picture with my sister, and I was like, I love my sister. And it's like, you would never know what I was going through just by looking at that one image. So
Yeah. Yeah. And look, I know you can meet up with your friend and say, how are you doing? They're like, oh, everything's fine. And but it's different to a picture that is very curated, or not even just curated. It's just it gives you the tiniest fraction of a snapshot. Whereas if you were with your friend and they said everything's fine and you spent, I don't know, 2 hours with them, you're still getting a little bit of a semblance of what's going on. And there's more depth to that, even if someone is still not being fully honest of what's going on, than the depth that you get from a picture.
yeah. And I mean, I always say it just in my life is you never know what another person is going through, which is why it's so important to pursue kindness and respect and empathy. Because with mental health, some people hold their struggles very well, and you wouldn't be able to know that they're struggling by looking at them or by talking to them. Which is I think, you know, with social media and just life, it's just so important to not assume that someone is doing well just because they look like it, because a lot of people tend to struggle in silence.
Yeah. Yeah. And one of the other things when I was reading on the Hidden Opponent blog, people talking about like injuries really turning into a downward spiral. And like
Yeah.
in your story, the ACL was like this perfect thing that it gave you a get out clause of like, great, okay, cool, I'm gonna exit. And I'm not kind of minimizing what you went through, because I know there was still ups and downs with it. But reading some of the other blog posts about this, like that being a really tough time for the athletes or student athletes.
Yeah. So just like we talked about kind of how my identity was in swimming and it was rocked by kind of my eating disorder and stepping away, I think athletes struggle with injury because injury can take you out of your sport. And then they're faced with, okay, I can't play my sport for a season or for a year or whatever it may be. And they don't know how to, they're not equipped to deal with that kind of loss of sport. And then, we see so many athletes who have recurring injuries or chronic injuries, and they're so passionate and they love their sport, but they don't know how to fight through the pain and the constant ins and outs of playing. And it leads, I think, to a lot of sadness and depression and anxiety, because I think a lot of athletes sometimes feel failed by their bodies that they're injured.
Yeah, I can definitely understand that. And I also think there's probably a lot of athletes who are similar to you, where they're dealing with an eating disorder that no one knows about. And if you get an injury and you're now no longer able to do X number of hours of training every day or week or whatever, that's a huge blow.
Yeah, I've known some athletes at Georgia who struggle with that. And that's where it's great. Georgia's great because you could meet with a nutritionist who can help you through kind of an injury perspective of fueling yourself. But I would like to say not every school has the luxury to have kind of staff members that can do that for you. So sometimes athletes are left to fend for themselves and try to figure out that struggle alone, which is so heartbreaking.
Yeah. Well, I think when you're talking about that in terms of negotiating with a dietitian and talk, like, someone's already at a certain level when you're able to do that. Like if the losing of sport or exercise is the point where you've not told anyone about your eating disorder, you don't even necessarily consider it an eating disorder, it's just in this coping mechanism, then that everything just falls apart. Like it's so much more difficult to deal with that than the sort of the tweaking that you're talking about.
For sure.
Yeah. And what about like burnout? Like I know this is another topic that is talked about a lot on the site. Talk about that with athletes.
Yeah. So I think there's two things that really can contribute to burnout. One is, like I mentioned earlier, if you just don't have enough balance in your life, you're going to get burnout. And as true as Victoria's recount of an athlete's schedule is, I do think there are very small and easy ways to incorporate balance into your life. And a lot of that comes from boundary setting, which is a hard skill to learn as an athlete. But so I think balance is number one for preventing burnout, or at least mitigating the risk of burnout. And you need to have other avenues of your life besides your sport that bring you joy. I think that's kind of the crux of it, is if all you do is care about your sport and all you do is eat, sleep, and breathe your sport, there's going to come a day where you're like, I just physically and mentally cannot do that anymore. Whereas, if you have like a standing Saturday coffee date and you go to a youth group or you take like a painting class, you have little pockets of peace in your life that can take the load off of you that sport can have. Yeah.
It's that one, your identity isn't solely in this thing, and two, like you know how to spend your time in other ways, and otherwise it's just I've got this one thing, and like this isn't just about sport. If your work is the one and only thing that you put all of your time and effort into, like, then that's also going to be pretty fragile. Like then there needs to be all of the other things going on, as opposed to just banking on this one thing.
Yeah. And I will also say, also a very uncommon thing to do in sport, but taking a break. I think that it is totally okay for athletes to go to their coaching staff and say, I need a week. I need a week to go be with my family and to rest and recharge, because sometimes I think athletes don't realize that all they might need is just a little bit of time off and they'd feel so much better. So I really recommend for athletes at the end of the season or maybe after a big competition, take a few days, like don't exercise, don't do sports specific activity, and just kind of rest and recharge. And it's super, I think that's super important and gratifying in terms of kind of rebalancing yourself and getting mentally ready to go into the next phase of training or whatever it may be.
Yeah. And again, like I think that is also a good test to see how much I'm in the driving seat. Because if you have an opportunity to take time off and you feel incapable of doing so, that's probably telling you something.
Oh, for sure. I remember times of my life where I was weary to take time off. Again, I think a common theme is it comes with time. I think for anyone struggling with their identity or an eating disorder or mental health or whatever it may be, it's all, you have to learn. You have to learn how to let your minds kind of come to different pathways and think differently and learn how to take a break. It won't just happen overnight. It's a process. Yeah.
Yeah, I totally agree. It is a practice and one that you need to do again and again to get good at doing and for it to feel very normal to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so the final question I have for you, like in your bio on the Hidden Opponent, it says, after college, Eva hopes to work in student athlete development at the collegiate or national level. So what would you like to bring to a role like this that is missing? Like, how would you like to improve things?
So that's a great question. So Georgia actually has this program called the Georgia Way. And it's basically you take anything outside of sport and they are going to help you with it. So career development, mental health, just all of these different areas of life that encompasses a student athlete, they provide support. So I would love to be in a role where I could give curriculum and programming and help to student athletes in areas outside of their sport. And especially at the collegiate level, career services is a huge thing. Setting athletes up for their first step after sport, that is just astronomically important in my mind. Yeah. I'd love to do that kind of work. I'd love to keep working around mental health, try to establish better care, better resources for student athletes that are struggling. And I think I just have a very strong passion of giving back to student athletes, obviously, because I can relate to them on a very personal level. Yeah. And one thing I said, I did a little speech at Georgia for National Eating Disorders Week a couple of years ago. And one thing I say is like, I want to be the person that 15-year-old me could have had to look up to. Like, I hope that one young girl or boy looks at me online or any of my videos and says, wow, like that I needed to know that. Like, that's so great to hear, because that's just one thing I was missing when I was a teenager.
Nice. Well, look, I do think that the landscape has changed and there is probably more available than when you were a teenager. And I'm glad that you are trying to be that person as well.
Yeah, thank you.
And so, look, this has been wonderful. Where can people go if they want to find out either more about you, but also the Hidden Opponent?
Yeah, so I'm on Instagram. It's just my name, Eva Merrell. And for the Hidden Opponent, you can find us on a variety of social platforms, Instagram, Twitter. We have a YouTube page where all of the coaches and professionals panels live, like I was talking about earlier. And you can find us at thehiddenopponent.org to read our blog. We have so many amazing athletes that are willing to share their stories with us. So you can find all of their stories there. And yeah, a majority of our content lives on Instagram, and we also share a bunch of great stories and resources there.
Perfect. Well, I will put links to all of that in the show notes. And yeah, thank you so much for your time. This has been awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it.
So that was my conversation with Eva Merrell. She is a great ambassador for eating disorder recovery and mental health in sport, and she and The Hidden Opponent are really doing great work. So if you're interested, then check out the links mentioned in the show and in the show notes. So I have a recommendation for you, and it's a podcast interview. And I was speaking to a friend recently, and she asked me if I had any podcast suggestions. And this was the first thing that came to mind. And it's an episode of Armchair Expert, which is Dax Shepard's podcast. And it's him interviewing the actress Anna Kendrick. So in the interview, Anna opens up about her time in an abusive relationship, the recent death of her father, her anxiety, the therapy that she's been doing. So as you can tell, this isn't a light episode. But what stood out for me with this were two things. So one was Anna's vulnerability and openness to share. And this wasn't her talking about this stuff for 5 minutes and then moving on to easier topics. This was pretty much the entirety of the episode of her being really open about her life and what's been going on. And then the second thing that stood out, and the reason why this happened in terms of her openness, was because of Dax. And not only do I think he is a masterful interviewer, he's also an incredibly open and vulnerable human being. And by his own admission, he sat in weekly AA meetings for 15 years or 17 years. So he's had a lot of experience of being with people who are sharing raw parts of their life. And so this kind of felt like you were eavesdropping on a therapy session. And Armchair Expert really is the only podcast that I regularly listen to these days. I don't listen to all of the episodes, but a good chunk of them are things that I will check out. And I honestly think that this is the perfect example of why. For me, Dax is incredible at making guests feel at ease and being able to hold space for true and authentic conversations. Armchair Expert is exclusive to Spotify, so you have to go there for listening to it. There are no episode numbers, but if you go to the show and then search Anna Kendrick, it will come up, and I'll link to that as well in the show notes. So that is it for this week's episode. As I mentioned at the top, shortly I'm going to be starting up a new program. It uses the same framework that I apply with clients, but in a group setting. And the program is going to start in late May and run for 12 weeks. There are limited spots available, so if you're interested, send an email to info@7-health.com with the word group in the subject line, and I can then send over further details. So that is it for this week. Next week, I'm off for the week. Some of the time I will be in Lisbon enjoying warmer weather and a friend's music festival, but I will be back with a new episode soon. So take care of yourself, and I'll catch you then.